evening. Welcome to the opening of Queer Justice, 50 years of Lambda Legal at the forefront of LGBTQ plus history. Over the past 50 years, Lambda Legal has litigated more than 1,000 cases, many with landmark rulings that changed the face of American law. Lambda Legal's wins have ranged from striking down sodomy laws, to allowing gay student groups to form at universities, to helping parents adopt their children, to advocating to secure healthcare for people living with HIV and AIDS, and much, much more. Queer Justice is not just an exhibition that celebrates these achievements, but a reminder, as you will see, that we will fight and we will persevere. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, the Zagar Family Foundation and Direct Wines. I'd like to thank our curator, Laura Berth Lima, who's back there, wave, who is a pleasure to work with, and our designers, Isometric Studio, for designing those beautiful panels I hope you all got the opportunity to see downstairs in room 101. Thank you to the team at Lambda Legal for being such incredible partners and for allowing us to present their stories. Thank you to the Center for being the debut host site for Queer Justice. The Center has been a pivotal landmark and community space for our movement and therefore holds a very special place in the LGBTQ plus timeline. We're gonna get started with our panel soon, but before I do that, I'd like to bring Kevin Jennings up to the stage, CEO of Lambda Legal.
First of all, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We really appreciate your support. I have to do some thank yous. First of all, thank you to Ben Garcia and the LGBTQ plus Museum. When we concocted this idea about a year ago, I think it took Ben about 4 nanoseconds to say, yes, we'll do that. So you have been fantastic partners. And thanks to Laura Beth and the team at Isometric, who turned a vision into a reality. Thanks to the Center for hosting us tonight. And I just want to point out 2 people who really deserve the most thanks tonight, who are with us. 2 of the founders of Lambda Legal, Nick Russo and Michael Lavery. The black nationalist Marcus Garvey once said, "A people without history is like a tree without roots." And in fact, that has been the status for so many LGBTQ plus people throughout history. Because the institutions that normally pass our history on to us, our schools, our families, our communities, don't do that for us. So we have to bring our history, which is too often forgotten, to light ourselves and to share it with our own community. And that's why this exhibit is so important to me. It's hard for people to imagine when Nick and Michael got started in 1973, how different the world was. In 43 states, including New York, it was illegal to be gay. Now, a lot has changed, a lot more needs to change, and we can learn from the history so that we can leverage our learnings from history to take us into the future. So thank you to the museum, thank you to the center, thank you to everyone who worked on the exhibit for bringing this history to light. Most of all, thank you, Michael and Nick, for having the vision to create this organization, and thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you. Thanks. I realized, Kevin, now that I didn't tell you all who Kevin was, so I'm going to just do that in a few sentences just so you all know who you just heard from. Kevin Jennings is a longtime leader in the LGBTQ movement. After helping students found the first Gay Straight Alliance Club while a high school teacher in 1988, he founded and led GLSEN, the first national organization dedicated to addressing anti-LGBTQ plus bias in schools. He went on to serve as an assistant secretary of education in the Obama administration, and today he serves as CEO of Lambda Legal. Thank you, Kevin, for your remarks. I'd now like to bring Richard Burns up to the stage. Richard D. Burns is a longtime gay activist leader and is chair of the founding board of directors of the American LGBTQ+ Museum, where we're so lucky to have him. He's the interim executive director of GLAAD in Boston and was executive director of The Center, where you all are right now, for 22 years, from 1986 to 2009. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you. I want to start by just saying, you know, I'm so glad that we're all here for the first exhibition, physical exhibition. We began meeting in Mitch Drazen's living room in January of 2017 because we knew it was high time, overdue time, for there to be a museum of queer history in this country. The person who planted the seed of the idea with us was actually Kevin Jennings. And so it all comes around, and I'm so glad that we're doing this partnership together. And so for a couple of minutes, I want you all to pretend it's 1978. 1978, 22-year-old Richard is the managing editor of a lesbian and gay news weekly called the Gay Community News. Subscribers in all 50 states. Lambda Legal and GCN were both founded in 1973, 50 years ago. GCN had a policy of sending a free subscription to any lesbian or gay man or queer person in federal prison who wanted it. And so we spent dozens every week in a brown paper envelope of copies of GCN to federal prisons across the country. And then in 1978, the US Bureau of Prisons declared the newspaper to be pornographic. And that, you know, we should be so lucky that it was pornographic. It was not. It was a lefty, lesbian, and gay liberation newspaper. And so who did we go to? We went to Lambda Legal. And Lambda Legal represented GCN in a case called NGTF, National Gay Task Force. Their newsletter was obscene too. So it was NGTF, Gay Community News, versus Norman Carlson and the US Bureau of Prisons. And that litigation went on for years. And I always love the fact that one of the law student interns at Lambda Legal, Noemi Maslia, years later went on to found Immigration Equality in the first floor of the center. But litigation goes on for years, and Lambda Legal won that case so that gay publications could indeed be delivered to federal prisoners who wanted them, who were queer. And so now, 45 years later, I'm really thrilled that we're closing another circle and that Lambda Legal can partner with the American LGBTQ+ Museum to celebrate and interrogate 50 years of queer litigation. And as you all know, and I think we cannot emphasize this enough, but the first panel of the exhibit says this: 1973, Roe versus Wade, the withdrawal of troops, American troops from the Vietnam War, and the founding of Lambda Legal. There was something in the water in 1973. And I'm so grateful that it was there, because Lambda Legal, and now we hope the museum, is going to make this a safer, stronger world for queer people everywhere. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. Thank you, Kevin. It is now my great privilege and honor to bring up our panelists for this exciting conversation that we are going to all enjoy. I've already been learning so much from these folks during our panel conversation. So if you brought your notebooks, you got your note apps in your phone, I promise you are going to need it. Ron Goldberg is an activist and author of the award-winning Boy with a Bullhorn, a memoir and history of ACT UP New York, and was a prominent member of ACT UP from 1987 to 1995. Blake Paskal is the Artist and Engagement and Community Programs Manager at Visual Aids and also an artist educator at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And Jose Abrigo is the HIV project director of Lambda Legal Defense and Education Fund and has dedicated his entire legal career to serving low-income people of color living with HIV and folks who identify as LGBTQ+. Please welcome to the stage. So I'm actually going to start with some words from Lambda Legal's website because I feel like they were written so well that I didn't actually have to write them myself. Look at that. But they really do contextualize sort of the conversation that we're about to have and sort of set the stage. When Bill Tom founded Lambda Legal in 1973, the LGBTQ+ community had long been navigating a world in which they often needed protection. Yet 1973, as Richard noted, was a turning point in the fight back for LGBTQ+ rights. On the heels of the Lavender Scare of the 1950s, police brutality of the 1960s, and then anti-police riots across the country, beginning with Stonewall. Lambda Legal joined and soon rose to the forefront of LGBTQ+ human rights advocacy with a mission to advance and protect the civil rights of LGBTQ+ and later HIV-positive people. So I want to start this conversation, and actually Ron and I had a nice conversation in the comment section of our shared documents. You all know how that goes. About activism, and I was sort of saying something like, oh, the activism that was happening on the streets hit a wall, and then the baton was passed to Lambda Legal or something like that. And Ron was like, actually, it was all activism, right? All of the work being done by community-based groups, whether providing services like gay men's health crisis or doing legal work like Lambda Legal, all of that is activism. And all of this work was going on concurrently, including the work of artists, sometimes in an integrated manner, other times in their own lanes, and on more than one occasion crashing into one another. That's what you said, right? And then he said, we all hit many of the same walls and attacked them from different angles. And I thought that was a really great sort of like redirection, right, for me, maybe thinking about activism as what happens on the street and what happens in the courts as something else. And so, Ron, I want to start with you, and I want to ask you, as a former member of ACT UP, what did activism look like in the beginning of the HIV crisis? What was happening? What were you all doing? What were you talking about in room 101 downstairs when you all were convening? What did it look like?
Well, thank you for having me on this panel, and thank you to Lambda for all your work. I want to just second the idea that all of the stuff that was going on was activism. I mean, ACT UP didn't start until 1987, which was 6 years into the known AIDS crisis. We now know that AIDS happened before then, but you know, New York Times made it official. And so the work that was going on in the 80s when AIDS hit was basically, you know, legal rights, gay rights, anti-discrimination stuff. AIDS hit 81. By 1982, you had GMHC, you had Shanti Project in San Francisco, APLA, all these other things that were sort of around healthcare and providing activism, providing care and education and information to people who needed it desperately, and the government was not handling it all. So that was important activism. In 73, it became PWA empowerment. PWA, people with AIDS, PWA Coalition, the Denver Principles, the idea that we are the experts, we know what's going on in our bodies, we are people living with, not dying from AIDS, and that we demand a place at the table for all discussions about our health, whether it's with our doctor, whether it's with clinical trials, whether it's about policy, or with the organizations that are being organized to take care of us. 75 GLAD, because the media was treating things terribly. And then in 86, we had the Hardwick's decision, which, for those of you who remember, there was a huge gathering down at Sheridan Square that night. And we sat in the street for hours. And then a few days later, it was July 4th. And there was this huge march downtown to the Battery where they were celebrating the centenary of the Statue of Liberty. And there was this huge group of queers demanding their rights and protesting Hardwick. And I think all of that sort of laid the groundwork for allowing ACT UP to happen. All this other work was happening. And then there was the bat signal, the silence equals death button, right? For those of you who are in New York, I remember vividly, like, walking out in the street, and suddenly on all the scaffolding, there were these huge black, signs with silence equals death and the pink triangle. And it was like, oh shit, something is happening or is going to happen. I don't know what, but keep your eyes open. Something is going to happen. And what happened was, act up.
Thank you. Thanks for painting that portrait for us. And it makes me think of you, Blake, too, of the art, right? Like this sort of, how does art play a role in the movement? And you're wearing that original pin. You didn't get that on eBay, right, Ron?
This is authentic. This is vintage. Been through a lot, a couple of jails.
Did you want to respond, Blake? That just made me think of you and Visual AIDS.
Yeah, Visual AIDS, arts organization that supports artists living with HIV, founded in 1988. And so it was right alongside ACT UP, and a lot of the people that, all of these people were mixing and finding strategies to, build momentum, build a coalition. Visual AIDS, our landmark program is Day Without Art, which is connected to World AIDS Day on December 1st. And when that program started in 1989, that was a call that was put out to arts institutions around the city, around the country, to respond to AIDS in some kind of way. And so that looked like, there were different ways that organizations chose to do that. Some organizations covered artwork in their museum with black cloth, replaced it with information about AIDS. Other places organized performances on that day. Of course, Visual AIDS is also known for the creation of the red ribbon, so that that is the symbol that is associated with HIV and AIDS, and that came from the Visual AIDS Artists Caucus, who were a group of people that were just sitting down, that were saying, like, what is a simple, just like the most simple thing that we can do that puts this, this imagery out in the world that is a constant reminder of what is going on. Yeah. And so alongside ACT UP, just thinking of like all of these interventions that can go forward in, the simplest way possible sometimes. Like silence equals death is such a simple phrase and means so much, even beyond AIDS.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for, I love that you're pulling out the symbology, and like someone had to sit and make that, right? And like, then it had to spread, and then people had to accept it, and then people had to own it and understand it, and how powerful art was and continues to be in this movement. Yeah.
And then I'll also add just that the other huge part of our work is the archive that we have, which was started in 1994 by Frank Moore and David Hirsch. And that was a response to all of the artists that were being lost to AIDS, and a frantic attempt to preserve their work in whatever ways possible. So that's the other leg of our work.
Jose, I want to turn to you and look at the Lambda Legal side. What were some of the key HIV cases that Lambda litigated right from the beginning, maybe to the present moment, if you could walk us through that?
So Lambda was won the very first HIV civil rights case back in 1983, People versus West 12th Tenant Corporation. That's where a tenant association tried to evict a Dr. Sonnabend, from his apartment for treating HIV patients. And ever since then, Lambda has sort of been the nation's HIV lawyer. Just some examples of cases that Lambda's litigated. In 1985, we did Doe versus Mutual of Omaha Insurance Company. That's where Lambda Legal represented a man living with AIDS who was denied life insurance by Omaha Mutual. And we are still litigating that issue today in Braidwood versus Becerra. Watkins versus United Airlines, that's where we represented a flight attendant who was fired by United Airlines after being diagnosed with AIDS. And there's still rampant HIV employment discrimination happening across the nation. Currently, we're suing Nashville in Tennessee because they have a policy that basically bars folks living with HIV from serving as first responders. We're also currently suing the Department of Defense, which is the largest employer in the world for HIV discrimination, because they do not allow folks living with HIV. Well, previously they didn't allow them to enlist. We won that case. So now folks living with HIV can enlist in the military, and now we're fighting for the right for them to deploy. In 1991, we represented a woman with AIDS who was denied treatment at a California hospital due to her HIV status. Access to health care is an issue we continually see today. In 1993, we represented a person with AIDS who faced evictions, similar to Dr. Sonnabend. In 1997, in TB versus School District of Philadelphia, we represented a young student with HIV who was denied admission to public school in Philadelphia, and that resulted in a favorable settlement. In 2003, we litigated In Re Jacob, where we represented a man living with HIV who was facing deportation from the United States, which helped ameliorate immigration policies for folks living with HIV. I mean, they're still terrible today, but they're not as bad as in 2003. In 2008, we litigated Doe v. Cuomo. That's where we challenged New York State's policy of requiring individuals to disclose their status to their sexual partners, even when they engage in safe sex practices. And currently, by the way, still in New York State, HIV is still criminalized, and we are currently leading the fight to decriminalize that here in New York State. We're currently suing Missouri because their prison system currently has a policy that basically places folks living with HIV who are sexually active, even if the sex was consensual, even if they are undetectable and therefore untransmissible, into solitary confinement. We had a client who was placed in solitary confinement for 8 years. According to the UN, anything longer than 2 months in solitary confinement is a torture, and she was placed in solitary confinement for 8 years. So that's another case we're litigating right now. So healthcare access, education access, insurance access, housing rights, economic rights. Those are the sort of cases that Lambda Legal has litigated over the years.
Wow, thank you. This is not just queer history, this is American history, right? You're talking about the prison system, you're talking about education, as you were listing the fields or the areas in which you're litigating. They really do stretch across all of our lives. Who's someone today that people in the room might not know about, that we might not be familiar with, but that is working against stigma for HIV/AIDS?
Personally, I'm a huge fan of Grand Fury, and so that was an artist trio comprised of A.A. Bronson, Felix Parts, and Jorge Santal. And I think they just made some of the most incredible conceptual art that exists amongst all conceptual art. If you don't know them, you definitely know the AIDS. It's based off the love symbol from Philly, but it's replaced with the letters from AIDS. So if I had to say someone that is not so well known, who's a personal favorite, is Michael Slocum. He was the editor and director of Newsline, which was a publication that centered on people living with HIV, and he also was a comic artist, and so he had a reoccurring comic strip in Newsline, and it just told the story of everyday experiences of himself as a queer black man living with HIV, moments within his life that were not things that you would hear at all about people living with HIV. There was a lot of humor in it, talking about his hookups, and yeah, I think he's definitely a name that has been lost and is coming back around to getting some attention. As far as artists that are working today, I have a list that I want to
I love it.
that I want to shout out a little bit. So Frederick Weston, he passed in 2020, but I think that he's a name that everybody should know. Some other people are Jessica Whitbread, who is a woman living with HIV. She's the founder of Love Positive Women, which is a yearly movement where women all across the world, people are asked to find a way to express love and admiration for women living with HIV. Joyce McDonald is a 72-year-old black woman living with HIV here in New York. She also has been making work since the 90s. Her work is incredible. She's a sculptor. There's just so many names of people that, that have not got their dues. My focus has always been black liberation, and for within HIV/AIDS, of course, black people are the most impacted within this country, and so my work has always been centered on raising up black voices living with HIV.
Thank you for that work. What is a bright spot that you're seeing in our movement today? And maybe what is the biggest challenge for us from your perspective that we're working with right now?
The bright spots are always the youth, right? I mean, I'm an old guy now. And I've gone and I've talked to students about ACT UP, about HIV history. I just did an activist workshop. And what's fascinating is that there's still this hunger. This generation actually is an activist generation. And I think they don't have the history. Why would they? Where is it taught? So that's part of our mission. I mean, you know, I'm sort of part of the first post-Stonewall generation of gay men to reach what I used to call middle age, but I can't really call middle age anymore. And but you know, so we're still trying to figure out how do we relate to younger people? How do we pass our histories on? I'm so thrilled about the museum happening. I think that's an incredible bright spot. But they're hungry for this. They want to know, and they're stunned when they find out what happened, what we did, and more importantly, what they can do. You know, when you tell history in the past, it always has this like, oh, they were experts. There's this patina of expertise comes on, and I try to go like, we made it up. You know, we didn't mean to yell at the church. It happened. You know, but when it happened, it's like, oh yeah, that's exactly what we meant to do. So I mean, I think that's the bright spot. As for the challenge, the world is a challenge. I mean, the dialogue that's going on now. We were talking earlier. I mean, you know, what is the whole, you know, revolution against woke is exactly what politically correct was back in the 80s. It's the same playbook. You know, the second you point at any sort of systemic issue or how language might affect how people see things, they flip it around and you're woke. And we used to be pariahs, we used to be disease carriers, now we're groomers. You know, will trans people be the next, you know, Willie Horton in the next election? I mean, it's the same playbook. And we have to figure out how to defeat it this time again.
One thing that I see as a bright spot is a renewed interest in HIV/AIDS art and culture. And a lot of that came out since COVID, that there was a huge push to look at the wisdom and knowledge that people living with HIV have and surviving through that pandemic, and then people that are long-term survivors and with us still, the knowledge that they have. And so with that renewed interest, there's also been a push more for a cure, because that conversation had kind of disappeared for a while. And seeing how quickly we got vaccines for COVID, for a lot of people, like reignited this fire of like, okay, we need one for HIV as well. So I see a lot of artists responding to that, and that's a bright spot. There's still a challenge of getting people to understand that HIV/AIDS is not a thing of the past.
So I think one of the bright spots is that the movement has recognized and is now pivoting to realize broadening the umbrella, increasing the umbrella of folks who are living with HIV. Currently, the African American population is the most disproportionately affected by HIV. And the community is pivoting more towards serving communities of color living with HIV. I just went to a conference, the title was A Love Letter to Black Women. Women are also folks who are getting HIV. And so just the broadening, I think, is a really bright spot. So we're continuing to support the legacy of HIV activism while simultaneously broadening the coalition to bring in a wider group. The solidarity of the coalition is amazing. The other side has been trying to pit us against each other. And the fact that we have said, no, we are not going to take that, and we stuck together, I think is really amazing. The challenge, I think, is I think exactly what you said. Folks often view HIV, just apathy. Folks view HIV as a thing of the past. There's fatigue. Why should I be concerned with abortion issues? Why should I be concerned with racial justice issues, with economic justice, with LGBTQ justice, with trans rights. Our fights are all interconnected. And that challenge is breaking through that wall of fatigue and resulting apathy, I think is a challenge that we're fighting.
I heard as you were speaking, like, opportunities for each of those challenges, that it sounds like, although there are challenges, that there's something that you all talked about in the bright spots that almost tackles those challenges. Could you talk about moments where ACT UP intersected with the courts and maybe share a few examples of how that happened?
Sure. I also just want to pick up on something Please. Jose said in terms of, one of the lessons I got from ACT UP was how interconnected we all were. I always took this sort of the education of an activist, right? And it was like, okay, you could even come into the room and you said, like, okay, drugs into bodies, but then you started like, okay, what drugs into whose bodies, and who had access, and if you had no housing, did you have health care? All these different things, and suddenly you realize that your community was not what you thought it was actually this wide. And what we had to pay attention to was, all these different issues. And actually the issues where we intersected with the courts, aside from getting arrested and all that stuff, and actually Lambda, because David Barr, who was one of the first HIV lawyers at Lambda, joined ACT UP right around the same time I did in the summer of '87, and he kind of used Lambda's network of volunteer lawyers to help get us out of jail. So thank you. So one of the cases was the needle exchange. Ed Koch had created a needle exchange program. Needle exchange is harm reduction, right? Just because you're an addict, it doesn't mean you should die. HIV epidemic was exploding in the IVDU population, IV drug user population, because you would share needles, you would share works, and so needle exchange was an attempt to get dirty needles off the streets and exchange them for clean needles. Koch's program was doomed for failure for multiple reasons. ACT UP organized its own needle exchange. A group went down to Delancey and was handing out clean needles and bleach kits and condoms and instructions on how to clean your works in English and Spanish. David Dinkins gets elected and decides to close down the needle exchange program because it's so unpopular, particularly in communities of color. ACT UP realizes that, okay, we need to up the ante here, and they announce that, okay, we're going to get arrested. The cops have been turning a blind eye to it, but ACT UP decided, okay, we're going to be handing out clean needles here, and possession of hypodermic needles was illegal in New York State. So just having them was illegal, never mind the drugs. So they got arrested and took it to court, and they pled that it was emergency, that it was pled necessity, medical necessity, that they were saving lives, and that's why they were breaking the law, and they won. So it also pressured the city to then take up and expand the needle exchange program. So that was a big one. The other was actually the women in AIDS. It was the CDC had an AIDS definition that was based on how the disease manifests in male bodies. Up through the early 90s, AIDS was only defined by the diseases that were found and the infections that were found in men. 50% of women with HIV who died without an AIDS diagnosis. And what this meant is that they were not eligible for support, they were not eligible for services, they were not eligible for Social Security. So what happened is Terry McGovern was a young lawyer working for the mobilization, I have to go through the acronym, the Mobilization for Youth Legal Services. She came to an ACT UP meeting because one of her clients actually had been evicted from his apartment when his lover died. So she came to this meeting, and the Women's Action Committee was doing a presentation on the CDC. They'd already been protesting. We'd been down to Atlanta yelling and screaming outside the building and trying other tactics. Terry was sitting in the meeting and went, oh, all these women clients who I have, a number of whom were coming out of jail, couldn't get Social Security, couldn't get disability, couldn't get any of these services. It's because of the AIDS definition. So she constructed a suit against the HHS and the Social Security Administration. And ACT UP wound up being sort of the ground troops. We were able to do all the research, make the connections to the community, probably with Lambda, I'm assuming, and other groups to sign on to this. And then having Terry do this legal strategy gave us another tool in our kit. We could go down and protest, but we also had this legal action backing us up. And Terry won the case. And it was this huge case that forced the CDC to change their definition in 1993.
I just want to also highlight the important activism of women who were in prison and a part of this work. Katrina Haslip, Joanne Walker.
They were part of the team that was working on it. Yeah.
To just like do work within the prison, connecting outside, and there was a lot of like incredible imagery that went along with that as well. So that's another way that the art comes in.
Yes. Many would say that Lambda's hard-won advances are under threat right now. We're seeing a lot of examples of that in our country specifically, but also around the world. And I was curious, what are the areas where you foresee Lambda needing to step in?
The strategy right now is to pit us against each other, divide and conquer. To use the vulnerable communities as a way to leverage against the larger movement, and use that to tear down our rights. They're trying to lay down the foundation for a repeat of Roe v. Wade on gay rights. So just as an example of them pitting us against each other, the governor of Tennessee this year in January decided to reject no strings federal funding for HIV prevention. It probably would have saved hundreds of lives in Tennessee. He rejected it because the money part of it went to Planned Parenthood, and he wanted to defund abortion, and also part of the money went to Vanderbilt University. And Vanderbilt University was providing gender-affirming care to minors, and he wanted to defund Vanderbilt University. And so he was willing to sacrifice hundreds of lives in order to score these political points. As a side note, also, we're hearing rumblings that the governor of Tennessee is on the short list to be the VP pick for a certain person who shall not be named. Luckily, we were able to fix that. We went to the CDC. We convinced them to bypass the state to direct fund the nonprofits. Braidwood v. Becerra is the case where some religious groups in Texas said, by forcing us to purchase insurance that covers PrEP, that goes against our religious beliefs, because PrEP is a drug used by promiscuous gay men, and we do not believe in supporting promiscuity. We do not believe in supporting homosexuality, and we don't want to pay for that. The result of that case struck down the preventative provisions of the ACA. So not only does it no longer require insurance providers to cover PrEP, but it also potentially, if the case goes into effect, luckily it's been stayed, would no longer require breast cancer screenings, would no longer require STI screenings. It affects 150 million people. The trans community is being used as a leverage group to attack the LGBTQ community. It doesn't surprise me that when an anti-trans bill passes, there's a spike in LGBTQ hate crimes in general. The fact that these groups are pitting us against each other, they're targeting the most vulnerable communities, people living with HIV, women, trans communities, and they're using it as a way to attack the larger movement. And that is what Lambda is currently fighting against.
That's a powerful point to leave off of, and it makes me think, like, what can we do about it? Like, what can we do about it, right? We know what you're doing in the course, and we know what Visual AIDS is doing, right? And Ron is out here educating the entire public, right? Teaching us our history, exactly. But what can we do about it? And so maybe we're going to take some questions from the audience, but then I'd love to leave with sort of like, what's the call to action for folks who are here and maybe wanting or feeling inspired to do something about everything that you're hearing.
I'm wondering if, since then, you have looked at different organizing traditions and have been able to recognize in those traditions things that you were doing or that you were figuring out along the way that might be helpful for people as they're beginning to think about how to do the work.
I mean, an interesting thing that happened is when ACT UP was forming, Channel 13, WNET, PBS, whatever, was showing Eyes on the Prize. And I think particularly in those early days, we continually referenced Eyes on the Prize. There's so much, and there's a movie called Rustin coming out, it's out. Yep. Watch it. But I think when I talk to young people, part of what they say is like, what do you think about, digital activism, this kind of stuff? And I'm like, it's great. You can get great reach, but it's not very deep. You need to get into a room with people, and not a Zoom room, but a room, because it builds with people with like-minded, who have the same targets, maybe not the same ideas. I mean, ACT UP was known for its, acrimonious meetings, but we wrestled it out, and it builds relationships, and it also gave us, you do an action, and then you'd be back in the room next week. Activism isn't one and done. It isn't send, And so I think that's certainly a strategy, but I'm still learning from, the civil rights movement, from what's going on. I mean, and from the young people even with the digital stuff. I mean, going viral. I mean, my God, what ACT UP could have done with going viral. Putting a condom over Jesse Helms' house. I mean, geez. So I think there's lessons to be learned both ways. And I think, but part of it is also learning your history. Seeing what was done and what was done before you. And it is remarkable. I mean, what is scary, though, is that we're not the only people learning this. I was talking, doing talks on the book and stuff, and I was suddenly seeing tactics that we did being practiced to a very different end. We sat down in the Capitol. We were nonviolent. We didn't shit in the Capitol. We sat down. We got arrested. But there are tactics that are used by other people. But again, eyes on the prize, right? I did this workshop yesterday, and it's like, okay, taking down the patriarchy, excellent, great goal. What's a little bit more doable as a first step? And it's that first step. It's showing up, right? Going to the demonstration. That's the thing. Okay, if you want to know what you need to do, show up, right? Go to the demonstration, attend the meeting, call your mother, go to the hospital, whatever it is, show up, and the rest follows. You have to take that first step. That is the most important thing about activism, is taking that first step.
So this has been really sustaining to hear you all speak about the history and the importance of the history and the historian. I've put together history-based museum exhibitions, and one thing we used to do, half jokingly but half serious, is kind of maintain a Google Doc of dissertations we want people to write or books we wish people would write that would help us do the work. If you all could pick a dissertation to assign to somebody or a book to come out that would help you in your work of using history in motion, what would those topics be?
I just wrote a book, so I'm going to plug mine. It's called Boy with the Bullhorn, and it's a memoir and a history of ACT UP New York. And what it does is it's not one of those, looking back and I remember the day. It's the activist education of a well-intentioned, if slightly naive, nice gay Jewish theater queen. And that's sort of the book. And it sort of follows what I said before, this education of walking into this movement and suddenly discovering all these connections and what went right and what went wrong. And I think I hope that particularly young people will find it useful and helpful also as a doorway into activism, and also to sort of encourage them to not be afraid to take those steps, because we fucked up all the time.
I kind of thought of the work of Saidiya Hartman, who writes from the lens of speculative fiction, and I would love to see something like that, but for the HIV/AIDS movement, thinking about whose voices were lost, maybe not lost permanently, then maybe they can still be uncovered, but there's so many points of view that we're still, searching for, particularly for Black Latino folks, trans folks, genderqueer folks. So I think that's a thing that comes to mind. And I always use this explanation when I'm in arts institutions thinking about how something could look different. There's this idea that it just it happened the way that it happened, but it could have also been a different way, and there could have been a broader coalition of voices from the beginning.
What would be helpful for me is how to trust science, because so much of science is being disregarded right now. HIV science and gender affirming care science, despite the fact that 99% of doctors believe that gender affirming care is medically necessary. The other side does not, so that would be helpful. And I think another resource that would be really valuable is how to tell your story to the larger community. Like what Ron said, what we need are people to educate and to go out and speak their voices. Litigation does not happen in isolation. It happens in the greater context of society. The other side is controlling the narrative. We're groomers. That people under the age of 18 should not make decisions about gender, about what their gender is. And that's the narrative. And we need folks to go out there and counter the narrative, like what we did with gay marriage, when the entire community stood up and said, hey, this is what being gay means, this is what marriage means to me, and there was this huge push across the nation. There's also the dominant narrative that AIDS is a gay disease. So narratives and resources on how to tell your voice. Be activists, step out, tell your story, and help change the narrative that's currently being dominated by the other side.
I come from Uganda, where the government has made the mainstream community believe that HIV in Uganda is mainly spread by queer people. In Uganda, when you're HIV positive, you can't walk into public hospital and you're LGBT person and get treated. If you opt in the hospital, instead doctors will call other colleagues and they'll make fun of you. So if I'm queer and HIV positive, I have to look for a private hospital to get treatment. I believe you can do more to stop this praise funding that go to countries like Uganda that have laws that deter some people, especially queer people, to get access to HIV treatment. Thank you.
Let me talk about PEPFAR because I'm currently lobbying Congress to keep funding for it. So PEPFAR, for folks who don't know, believe it or not, it was legislation passed by George W. Bush, probably the best piece of legislation that he ever passed. Basically, it sends funds to developing countries for HIV care and prevention. It was a bipartisan bill, always renewed constantly, and this harkens back to an example of how they're pitting us against each other. They are currently trying to defund PEPFAR because they say it funds abortions. It does not fund abortions, but they're saying it does. PEPFAR has saved 23 million lives, not thousands, millions of lives. And so to defund it is barbaric and inhumane. Congress is basically trying to insert these riders that say you can't use this money to talk about diversity. You can't use this money to talk about LGBTQ folks. You can't use this money to fund to provide abortions, gender affirming care. They're trying to insert this into all these bills. We're trying to fight it off. I'm in DC almost every week, trying to work with Congress people, but we are fighting for PEPFAR. It is crucially important. The community knows how important it is.
We were going to leave off on a positive note, like, what can we do? What are we going to do? I heard it from Jose when you were talking about the dissertation, right? I heard, like, tell your stories, elevate your voices. I heard it from Ron when it was like, show up, call your mother, right? Take that first step. And then I want to make sure that that's what you want to leave with. So please affirm that in one sentence if you could, and then I'd love to hear from Blake.
One of my favorite quotes is by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. That's been the history of gay rights. We are currently fighting to make sure that gay rights does not follow the route that Roe v. Wade has taken, and we are fighting for Roe v. Wade as well. So please get involved. Tell your stories. In addition to litigation, that is probably one of the most important things. Changing the national zeitgeist, changing the discourse, the narrative that's happening, because that affects how judges decide cases. So you have power in your voices, as ACT UP, as Visual AIDS has shown. Use it.
So for visual aids from the art side, I mean, you can support us directly. We give direct grants to artists living with HIV to help them continue making their work. You can tap into all of our events that are happening. World AIDS Day is right around the corner. Our biggest event that happens each year is Day Without Art, supporting our work. And yeah, being an ally to the people in your own life living with HIV, understanding the right language to use when talking about people living with HIV, and asking the people in your life like what they want and need to feel supported.
I actually want to say two things. One, I don't know that we would have gotten marriage equality if it wasn't for, strangely enough, for AIDS, because it forced people to come out. Suddenly people knew it was your brother, your son, your uncle, whatever was coming home and saying hi. Often it was the double whammy. It was like, hi, I'm gay, hi, I have AIDS. But it changed the perception. Another thing that changed perception were things like ACT UP, I think. There's when we did the FDA action in Washington in 1988, it was incredible, visuals, all these, signs and people. It was people doing die-ins and tombstones and all this incredible stuff. The New York Times was the only one. They had a photo of this one guy hunched over like this. No identification of what he was, surrounded by police. That was the photo in the Times. Everyone else had these incredible photos. But 1 year later, they did an article in the Week in Review about how, suddenly, the FDA has changed its tune, and suddenly, activists are there, and there was a 5-panel shot of these people, ACT UP members. They had their arms over their heads. They were in white coats with the red handprint on the back, marching towards a phalanx of police with the Silence Equals Death banner atop, and that was the picture of who gay people were. And so telling your story, being out there, standing for your truth, it's corny as hell, but you can make change happen. We were part of a community where we saw change happen in our lifetimes. We have moved the dial. They are trying to push it back. Keep pushing. We can do it. We've done it before. We continue to do it. So get out there.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jose. Please, a round of applause to our panelists. Jose, Blake, Ron, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. Queer Justice will travel. Queer Justice, this is the debut, New York City debut. We are going to Atlanta. We are going to LA. We're going to Chicago. We're going to Dallas. And we're going to DC. So if you have friends in any of those cities or you're from those cities, please check out our website, queerjustice.info, so you can see the whole run of the show. And you can catch it in another city, or you can invite folks to catch it in those cities as well. That will come along with a really wonderful suite of programs, so I hope you will check those out. The American LGBTQ Plus Museum will be partnering with the New York Historical Society on Sunday, December 3rd, for a World AIDS Day event. We will be doing quilt making that day with Pat Morgan, who designed one of the quilts, and the AIDS Memorial quilt will be on display at the New York Historical Society, so please go check that out. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists, and thank you so much for spending your time with us this evening. Queer Justice is open till 9 o'clock. Thank you. Good evening.